Mark Wahlberg had always loved the open road, the hum of a Harley beneath him, and the way the wind swept away the pressures of Hollywood. On this quiet morning, he was far from the glare of paparazzi and red carpets, cruising down an old country highway in a small Midwestern town, a place almost frozen in time. He wore simple jeans, a white t-shirt, and sunglasses, hoping to be just another face passing through. His destination didn't matter. He was riding to clear his head, to enjoy solitude. The road was nearly empty, framed by golden wheat fields and distant mountains. There were no traffic lights here, only the occasional barn, an abandoned gas station, and long stretches of road that offered peace to any traveler seeking it. As he turned a bend, a rustic diner came into view, nestled between a junkyard and an auto repair shop. It had a blinking neon sign that read Marge's Grill, and the scent of sizzling bacon drifted into the road. Mark smiled and decided it was time for breakfast. Pulling into the gravel lot, he parked his motorcycle next to a row of rusted pickups and a line of custom choppers that looked like they belonged in a gang museum. The parking lot was quiet, the morning still early enough that only a few locals were inside. As he stepped into the diner, a bell jingled above the door, and every head turned. The room had a warm, greasy charm. Checkered floors, vinyl booths, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the Reagan era. Mark nodded politely to the other customers and took a seat by the window. He noticed a group of 6 large men at the far corner, wearing leather vests with matching patches. Flaming skulls, iron crosses, and one that simply read Hellfangs. Their tattoos were bold, their beards wild, and their voices loud enough to fill the room even in silence. Mark didn't flinch. He'd dealt with tougher crowds on set and in real life, but he knew how to blend in and mind his business. The waitress approached with a smile, recognizing him instantly but saying nothing. He appreciated that. She poured him coffee, and he ordered eggs, hash browns, and pancakes, looking forward to eating in peace. But peace wouldn't last long. The Hellfangs had noticed him too. One of them, a hulking man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, leaned over to whisper something to his friend. They chuckled, then stared. It wasn't just curiosity, they seemed to take offense at his presence. Maybe it was his clean clothes, his Hollywood face, or the fact that his bike wasn't a part of their outlaw aesthetic. Mark kept his eyes on his food, pretending not to notice, but he knew the dynamic was shifting. It always started the same way. Muttering, staring, whispering. The energy changed. One of them, who looked like the leader, stood and walked toward the counter, deliberately passing close to Mark's table. As he passed, he bumped Mark's chair just enough to spill a little coffee on the table. Mark wiped it with a napkin, still silent. The man smirked and returned to his table. It wasn't about coffee. It was about control, about seeing if the stranger would push back. Mark sighed inwardly. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want to ruin his morning. But the storm clouds were gathering, and instinct told him this wasn't going to end with breakfast and a tip. Outside, a few more motorcycles rolled into the lot. Reinforcements, or maybe just more trouble. The door chimed again as 2 more Hellfangs entered. They looked around, laughed when they saw Mark, and joined the others. The tension in the diner thickened like old syrup. Conversations died down. Even the waitress began to look nervous. Mark finished his food quietly, left a generous tip, and stood to pay. The cashier glanced between him and the bikers, unsure what to say. As Mark walked toward the register, another biker stood directly in his path, blocking his way. "You in a hurry, sunshine?" the biker said, voice gravelly, smile sharp. Mark looked him in the eye, calm and steady. "Just heading out," he said simply. The biker chuckled. "Maybe stick around. Could use some entertainment." A few of the others laughed too. The leader stayed seated, watching like a wolf from across the room. Mark paid for his meal, nodded to the cashier, and moved past the biker without another word. He pushed the door open and stepped into the sunlight. Behind him, the bell jingled again. Footsteps followed. The peaceful morning had shattered. The countryside was still silent, but the chaos had found its way in. What started as a calm breakfast run was about to become something entirely different. The heavy clang of the diner door swinging shut behind him felt like a signal, a silent cue that the game had begun. Mark didn't look back as he walked across the gravel parking lot, each step deliberate, controlled, his boots crunching the loose stones beneath. The early morning sun glinted off the chrome of his motorcycle, and for a brief second, he considered the possibility that the bikers might let it go, might just return to their greasy breakfasts and let him ride on. That hope evaporated quickly. Voices echoed behind him, low and mocking at first, then louder. One voice cut through the others like a blade. "Hey, Hollywood!" Followed by a chorus of laughter. Mark turned slowly, his sunglasses reflecting the cluster of Hellfangs now spilling out of the diner like wolves from a cave. The leader stood at the center, a tall man with dark eyes, a sunburnt face, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. His leather vest was adorned with pins and patches, his hands scarred and calloused. "What's the rush?" he called out, tossing the cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. Mark's face remained impassive, unreadable. "Just passing through," he replied calmly, voice low but firm. "Didn't mean to step on any toes." One of the bikers, shorter but stockier than the rest, stepped forward and scoffed. "You walk in here like you own the place. You think that bike of yours makes you one of us?" He motioned toward Mark's Harley, which, though not custom like theirs, was a powerful machine, clean, efficient, and clearly well-maintained. "I didn't say that," Mark said evenly. "I'm just out for a ride. That's all." The bikers exchanged glances, grins spreading like wildfire. "You hear that?" one of them barked. "Pretty boys just out for a ride." Laughter again, louder this time, edged with menace. Another biker spit on the ground near Mark's boot. "Thing is, stranger," the leader said, stepping closer now, "we don't take kindly to outsiders dropping in without showing respect." Mark raised an eyebrow slightly, the only sign that their words were even registering. "Didn't realize I'd broken any local laws," he said. "Just ate my breakfast, paid for it, and I was on my way." The leader's eyes narrowed, the smirk on his face tightening into something colder. "Respect ain't about laws," he said. "It's about knowing your place. And around here, Hellfangs run things." A moment of silence stretched between them, tense and electric. Mark's body remained relaxed, but his mind was already calculating. Distance between them, number of opponents, the layout of the lot, the locations of the bikes and trucks. The years of training had trained his instincts well, and right now they told him this was going to turn physical. Another biker, the one with the snake tattoo, walked around to Mark's other side, trying to flank him. "Bet you've never been in a real fight," he said, flexing his neck, the snake shifting with the motion. "Bet you're all muscles for the camera." The others laughed again, clearly entertained by the ritual of intimidation. "You one of those movie tough guys?" another asked. "You gonna cry and call your agent when we take your bike?" Mark didn't respond. He just stood there, like a statue carved out of calm resolve, a man entirely in control of himself. That silence unnerved them. Bullies thrived on fear, and Mark was giving them nothing. The leader stepped closer, close enough now that Mark could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath. "Tell you what," he said, his voice dropping lower. "You hand over your keys, apologize for being disrespectful, and maybe we let you ride out of here with your teeth intact." Mark's eyes flicked toward the diner for a brief second. A few faces were pressed against the window now, curious, worried, watching. The waitress was among them, holding her phone in her hand, likely recording or calling someone. "This really the way you want to go?" Mark asked, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. It wasn't a challenge, not yet, just a final chance. The leader sneered. "Oh, he's threatening me now." He reached out and shoved Mark, a heavy-handed push that staggered most men. Mark didn't budge. The laughter died quickly. The rest of the gang stopped moving, sensing the moment shift. That was the last warning they were going to get. Mark slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes not filled with fear, but a steady, unwavering focus. "I'm going to give you one more chance," he said, still calm, but with a new edge to his voice. the steel now unmistakable. "Walk away, all of you." The leader barked out a laugh, but there was hesitation behind it. "You serious?" Mark nodded once. "Very." But the leader couldn't back down now. Not in front of his crew, not with the waitress filming, not after all the tough talk. His pride wouldn't allow it. He motioned to the others. "Let's show Hollywood what real men fight like." And with that, the confrontation reached the point of no return. Mark took a slow step back, not out of fear, but to create space. Space to maneuver, space to breathe, space to make a decision that could shape the rest of the day in blood or peace. The Hellfangs closed in without hesitation. 6 bulky men forming a loose semicircle in the gravel lot, the sound of their boots crunching like dry bones underfoot. Engines idled nearby as the freshly arrived bikes remained unattended, their owners now salivating at the idea of violence. But Mark hadn't survived Hollywood's worst critics and backroom power plays without learning control, and he hadn't earned his black belt by jumping at every swing that came his way. Years of discipline rippled just beneath his skin, cloaked by casual charisma and a reputation built more on roles than reality. But what these men didn't know was that he had trained for moments exactly like this, moments where walking away was tested by testosterone and rage. He exhaled through his nose, scanning each man's stance, noting how the leader stood cockily with his feet too wide apart, how the tattooed one kept flexing like a peacock, and how the youngest in the group shifted nervously, his hands twitching. Mark turned slightly, his body now facing the lot's open exit, silently inviting them to let him leave. "That offer's still on the table," he said, voice low and certain. "You can end this right here." But they only laughed harder, the leader stepping in closer, pressing his forehead near Mark's like a schoolyard bully who had never been told no. "This ain't Hollywood, pretty boy," he growled. "This is our turf." Mark gave him one last look, one that said everything without a single extra word. Then he turned his back and began to walk away. That was when the first punch came, launched like a cannonball from the side by the man with the snake tattoo. A wild haymaker aimed at the back of Mark's head. But it never landed. In one smooth, almost fluid motion, Mark pivoted on his heel, raised his arm to block the punch, and used the attacker's own momentum to send him tumbling headfirst into the side of a parked pickup truck. The loud clang rang through the lot, silencing every laugh. Time seemed to slow. The other bikers froze, shocked by how fast it happened. The leader roared and lunged, fists swinging, but Mark sidestepped the first blow, ducked under the second, and delivered a precise palm strike to the man's sternum that knocked the wind from his lungs and dropped him to his knees. "I didn't want this," Mark muttered as the chaos exploded around him. The youngest biker rushed him from behind, thinking Mark was distracted, but Mark sensed it. The crunch of gravel, the sharp intake of breath, and twisted, grabbing the man's jacket and flipping him over his shoulder in one seamless motion. The kid hit the ground hard, groaning, his eyes blinking in confusion. Another came in, this one wielding a chain he'd pulled from his belt loop, swinging it wildly like a flail. Mark ducked the first swing, dodged the second, and then stepped in close, jamming an elbow into the man's ribs before sweeping his leg and planting him flat on his back. It was controlled, efficient. He wasn't looking to maim, just disable. His strikes weren't brutal. They were precise, surgical. 2 men remained, the stocky one and a taller biker with a braided beard and cracked knuckles. They hesitated for a second, eyes darting between their groaning friends and the man they thought was a pushover. Then the bearded one charged. He threw a heavy punch aimed squarely at Mark's jaw, but Mark parried it with a raised forearm and countered with a spinning back kick that landed with a thud in the man's abdomen, lifting him off the ground for a split second before he collapsed. The stocky one let out a frustrated roar and tried to tackle Mark, aiming low. But Mark braced himself and caught the man's shoulders, then dropped his weight and used the biker's forward motion to throw him hard into the gravel. The lot was suddenly filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and the distant hum of engines. Mark stood in the center of it all, his chest rising and falling in calm rhythm, his expression unreadable. The leader, still on his knees, looked up at him with disbelief, clutching his chest. "What the hell are you?" he gasped. Mark stepped closer, his shadow falling over the man. "I'm someone who asked you to walk away," he said evenly. Around them, the scene looked like the aftermath of a small war. The Hellfangs were scattered, some crawling, some still unconscious, others stunned into silence. Inside the diner, faces pressed against the windows watched with jaws agape, phones in hand, capturing every second. The waitress had stepped outside, her eyes wide, her hand over her mouth. Mark looked around, making sure none of the bikers were seriously injured, then crouched beside the leader. "I'm not here to humiliate you," he said, his tone steady but firm. "But you need to understand something. Respect isn't taken. It's earned." The leader said nothing, just glared, the fury in his eyes dimming under the weight of reality. "You picked the wrong guy," Mark added. Then he stood, dusted off his shirt, walked over to his bike, and calmly swung his leg over it. The engine roared to life with a twist of his wrist. He didn't look back as he pulled out of the lot, leaving behind a broken circle of pride and the echoes of a lesson taught without cruelty. The Hellfangs had threatened a stranger they thought was soft, someone they could toy with for sport. Instead, they had learned what true discipline looked like. Not the rage of a brawler, but the strength of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and only chose to show it when given no other choice. The dust hadn't even settled in the parking lot before phones buzzed and notifications pinged across small-town timelines. The video of Mark dismantling the Hellfangs spreading like wildfire, frame by frame of jaw-dropping precision. Inside the diner, the waitress who had witnessed it all clutched her phone tightly, whispering to a stunned cook that she was pretty sure that was Mark freaking Wahlberg. While across the street, a mechanic leaned against a car hood, eyes wide, muttering expletives under his breath. Word traveled faster than gas on a flame, and by the time Mark was several miles down the highway, his calm, calculated defense had already become local legend. The Hellfangs remained sprawled across the lot, nursing bruises and damaged egos, their pride punctured more deeply than their ribs. The leader struggled to stand, helped up by the youngest biker, who kept glancing back at the diner window where the waitress stood like an accidental war reporter. "He wasn't just some actor," the kid mumbled, as if trying to convince himself. "Did you see what he did?" The leader didn't answer, still trying to find his breath, still trying to understand how a man he outweighed by 40 pounds had flattened his crew with the poise of a surgeon and the force of a tornado. Within the hour, local news channels picked up the footage. Hollywood star destroys biker gang in self-defense, and the headline alone caused online debates to ignite. On Twitter, hashtags like #WahlbergWhirlwind and #HellfangFail started trending. TikTokers added slow-motion soundtracks and zoom-ins to the video, treating it like an action movie teaser, while some skeptics cried staged until more angles and diner security footage began to circulate. The story went national by noon. Cable talk shows brought in martial arts experts to break down Mark's technique, pointing out his form, his restraint, and how clearly this wasn't a fluke or a lucky shot. "That's years of training," one former Navy SEAL said on a panel. "You don't move like that unless you've practiced it 1,000 times." Meanwhile, the Hellfangs became internet memes, their photos pulled from public profiles and plastered across social media with captions like, "Don't start what you can't finish," and "When you try to bully John Wick's cousin." In the town itself, the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to buzz. Everyone wanted to talk about it. The fight, the celebrity, the humiliation, the sheer surrealism of it all. Parents who had once complained about Mark's movies were suddenly citing his discipline as a good example for their kids. Local teens reenacted the fight outside gas stations using cardboard cutouts and toy chains. The Hellfangs, once feared and untouchable in their dusty corner of the state, found themselves at the center of ridicule. Some locals crossed the street to avoid them, not out of fear anymore, but embarrassment for them. Others offered fake sympathy while barely containing laughter. The leader, who had once walked into bars like a king, now couldn't order a beer without someone in the background humming a movie theme or quoting lines from The Fighter. Their fortress of intimidation had crumbled beneath the weight of a single man's refusal to be provoked, and the public reaction rubbed salt into every wound. At first, they tried to spin it. They claimed Mark had blindsided them, that it was 6-on-1 because he was armed, or that he'd used stunt doubles. But the footage didn't lie. The diner security cameras showed it all. How Mark had been calm, how he'd offered them a chance to walk away, how he'd fought only when cornered. With every angle exposed, their lies only made things worse. Eventually, the gang retreated into silence, licking their wounds in private and canceling appearances at biker rallies where they'd previously been treated like royalty. Mark, meanwhile, kept riding. He stayed out of the public eye for a few days, not because he was hiding, but because he didn't care about the noise. For him, the incident wasn't about going viral, it was about self-respect, boundaries, and never allowing ego to dictate his actions. But the world had other plans. His phone rang constantly. Agents, producers, reporters, podcast hosts, and even martial arts schools calling to ask him to speak. He ignored most of them, preferring to take a detour into the mountains and camp for a night under the stars. That night, as he sat beside a fire, sipping water and staring into the flames, he reflected on how quickly things could shift. He had trained for discipline, not destruction. He had studied karate not to dominate, but to understand himself, to learn patience, control, and power held in check. He wasn't proud of having to fight, but he wasn't ashamed either. It had been necessary. It had been right. In a nearby town, news anchors still replayed the video. A military veteran who owned a local dojo called it a textbook example of self-defense without excessive force. Online forums flooded with praise, with one commenter writing, "He fought like a ghost, never where they thought he'd be, and always a step ahead." Others began sharing stories of celebrities who secretly trained hard, but none carried the same weight now. Mark Wahlberg had just reminded the world that the quietest man in the room might still be the most dangerous, and he didn't need explosions, special effects, or a script to prove it. When Mark Wahlberg finally stepped back into the public eye a few days later, it wasn't with a press conference, a TV appearance, or a red carpet moment, but rather a quiet visit to a community martial arts center on the outskirts of Los Angeles where he'd occasionally trained in his early days. The building was modest, a weathered brick structure tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, but it had a heart that pulsed with discipline, sweat, and purpose. Mark arrived unannounced, walking in with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and nodding at the receptionist like he'd never left. Inside, the scent of aged mats and wooden weapons hung in the air, and the sound of youth echoed through the space, grunts, laughter, and the slapping of bare feet against polished floors. He greeted the instructors with genuine warmth, bowing respectfully before stepping into the dojo and changing into his GI. Word hadn't reached the students yet, or maybe they just didn't care who he was. In this space, everyone wore the same uniform, followed the same traditions, and bowed before the same ideals. When Mark took his place on the mat, there were no phones filming, no questions about the fight, just the familiar rhythm of kata and the humbling silence of repetition. Later that afternoon, however, he was invited to speak, not as a celebrity but as a practitioner, someone who had walked the path with intention. Standing before a room of teenagers and young adults, their faces curious and expectant, Mark spoke without notes or bravado. He didn't mention the Hellfangs by name or describe the fight blow by blow. Instead, he talked about self-control, about the weight of strength and the responsibility that came with it. "Violence," he said, "is not something to seek. It's a last resort, a tool of protection, not dominance." He paced slowly, voice even and sincere, his hands moving with quiet emphasis. "You train so you don't have to prove yourself. You master your body so your mind can stay calm when things get loud." The students listened intently, some nodding, others sitting frozen, absorbing every word. "I could have fought those men the moment they stood up," Mark continued. "But I didn't, because power is restraint, and honor is knowing when to walk away." His words weren't rehearsed, but they struck with the impact of a perfectly placed strike. In the days that followed, video snippets from that talk surfaced online, not posted by Mark, but shared by students and instructors moved by his presence. The world watched again, but this time the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about a celebrity who knew how to throw a punch. It was about what that punch represented, about the idea that true strength meant choosing not to use it unless absolutely necessary. Podcasts discussed his speech, and educators played clips in high schools during morning announcements. Martial arts forums praised his humility, noting how rare it was for someone with global fame to return to their roots without cameras and PR teams in tow. Eventually, Mark agreed to sit down for one interview, not with a major network or entertainment outlet, but with a veteran martial artist who hosted a quiet YouTube series dedicated to the philosophy of combat sports. In that hour-long conversation, filmed simply in the back of the dojo with a single camera and no frills, Mark opened up. "I didn't grow up with peace," he admitted. "There was anger, chaos, street fights. But martial arts gave me something else. It gave me a center, a way to find control." The interviewer asked him what he thought when the bikers surrounded him, and Mark paused for a long moment. "I thought about my kids," he said finally. "I thought about how easy it would be to let ego take over, to fight just because I could. But that's not what karate teaches. Teaches patience. Teaches you to breathe before you act." The video gained millions of views in days, but not because of drama or spectacle. It was the honesty that gripped people, the sense that beneath the movie star persona was a man shaped by something deeper. The Hellfang incident faded into the background, no longer the punchline of memes but the prologue to a larger conversation. Mark used the momentum not to build a brand, but to elevate others. He partnered with martial arts academies across the country to fund scholarships for underprivileged youth, creating opportunities for kids to train, to find their discipline, to find themselves. Interviews and articles now focused not on the fight but on what came after. Headlines read, "From Brawl to Brotherhood," "Wahlberg's Martial Message," and "Karate, Not Chaos." How Mark Wahlberg turned conflict into a teaching moment. Parents reached out to the Scholarship Foundation in droves, grateful for the chance to channel their children's energy into something positive. Schools invited him to speak, and though he declined most, he made appearances at youth centers and recovery programs, talking not about Hollywood or stunts, but about the quiet journey of discipline, of rebuilding character from the ground up. He became, unwittingly, an ambassador for martial arts in the modern world, not because he asked for it, but because he embodied its principles when it mattered most. And in a world often thirsty for spectacle, the image of Mark Wahlberg standing barefoot in a modest dojo, speaking softly to a room of young students, proved to be more powerful than any viral video of a knockout punch. What lingered wasn't the clash of fists but the calm after the storm. The message that mastery begins not with power, but with knowing when not to use it. Weeks passed, and although the frenzy around the biker incident had begun to die down in the media, its echoes continued to ripple through public consciousness, keeping Mark Wahlberg's name tied not to scandal or promotion, but to an unexpectedly human story of power used with wisdom. In interviews, even ones unrelated to the event, celebrities, athletes, and thought leaders began referencing the incident as a modern parable about character under pressure, a real-life example of the kind of self-control rarely seen when egos collide. But for Mark, it was never about the attention. It was about reinforcing what he'd always believed deep down: that you could show strength without ever raising your voice, and that the most powerful statement often came from walking away instead of retaliating. Still, despite the quiet personal victories and the positive outreach that followed, he knew there were still questions that lingered in the public's mind, questions about the deeper philosophy that had shaped his reaction, about what it really meant to carry the weight of that kind of training into everyday life. So when a renowned university reached out and asked him to deliver a keynote at their annual Voices of Integrity symposium, Mark surprised even his own inner circle by accepting. The event was attended by students, scholars, and community leaders. A diverse group of minds gathered to explore the intersection of discipline, morality, and leadership. Mark arrived in a simple black suit, no entourage, no pre-written script, only a few thoughts scribbled in a leather-bound notebook he kept with him during quiet mornings. The auditorium buzzed as he stepped onto the stage, not to thunderous applause but to a respectful, thoughtful silence. People wanted to hear, not just cheer. He took the microphone and paused, surveying the crowd not like a performer gauging a reaction, but like a man measuring the weight of what he was about to share. "You don't learn discipline on movie sets," he began, his voice clear and level. "You learn it in quiet places, away from cameras, where there's no reward except the knowledge that you've grown stronger than the day before." He spoke not as an actor or an icon, but as a student of life, describing his early days of anger and restlessness, his need for direction, and how martial arts had become his compass, not to make him invincible, but to make him accountable. He described the moment outside that diner with raw honesty, not glorifying it but breaking it down as a test of everything he trained for. "When I stood in that parking lot," he said, "I wasn't thinking about how many people I could take down. I was thinking about how not to escalate a situation that was already burning hot." The audience listened with rapt attention as he wove in reflections on personal responsibility, the art of restraint, and the danger of living reactively in a world that rewards aggression. He touched on the pressure of celebrity, the temptation to prove something because the world expects you to, and how real power was found in resisting that urge. "There's a difference between being capable and being dangerous," he said, letting the words hang for a moment. "The capable man knows when to walk away. The dangerous man walks toward destruction even when he doesn't need to." After his speech, the room erupted, not into frenzied cheers, but into something deeper. A standing ovation that felt less like applause and more like respect. He left the stage quietly, answering questions backstage with thoughtfulness, signing a few books, and spending time with students who asked about training, about purpose, about how to stay centered in the chaos of modern life. One young man asked how Mark had stayed calm when surrounded by people looking to provoke him, and Mark simply replied, "Because I've trained for the moment I don't want to fight more than the one I do." That line was quoted widely in the days that followed, appearing on posters, in martial arts academies, and across motivational blogs that praised its quiet power. More than a few journalists noted how different Mark seemed in person, grounded, articulate, unaffected by fame. In fact, some suggested that this incident had ushered in a new chapter for him, not as an actor or a businessman, but as a quiet voice of reason in a world desperately searching for real role models. Months later, when the Hellfangs were interviewed in a more reflective state, even they acknowledged that what happened in that parking lot had changed them. The leader, now far less brash, admitted in a local paper that Mark hadn't humiliated them for sport, but had shown mercy. "He could have done worse," he said, "but he didn't. That stuck with me." For Mark, that was the quiet victory, the shift in perspective, the ripple of impact that extended beyond fists and bruises. In an era defined by overreaction, he had demonstrated the power of thoughtful stillness, of responding instead of reacting, and in doing so had ignited conversations in places he never expected. From barbershops to boardrooms, dojo mats to university panels, his name now floated not just as a performer, but as a man who proved, in a single morning, that the strongest weapon you can carry is control. And while he continued to film, to train, and to live his life with as much normalcy as a celebrity could manage, there was an undeniable sense that something had shifted permanently, that the biker gang hadn't just run into a man with a black belt, but into a man who had earned every stripe on that belt by mastering not just combat but character.